Have you guys heard about the black guy who collects KKK robes? No, no, there's no punchline here. I'm talking about Daryl Davis, a black jazz musician whose hobby is befriending members of the KKK. And we'll circle back on that in a minute. If it's okay, I'd like to talk about race for a few minutes, specifically kind of my own story and my own revelation of my own racist tendencies. And while none of it was on purpose, I also realize it doesn't necessarily make it okay. And I know I just have a few seconds here as you guys try to decide if you're going to watch this video or not. And let me see if I can help you out a little bit and talk to you about people who shouldn't bother to watch this video. Um, if you participate in marches or just generally well informed about race issues here in the United States, I probably have nothing new to say. If you actively hate people of another race, I don't think anything I can say is going to make a difference. On the other hand, if you fall somewhere in the middle, and I think a lot of us do, and maybe you don't understand the protests, or maybe you feel like you do understand the protest, but when you look at it, you go, oh, it's just people complaining, or people looking for handouts, or maybe words you would choose to describe the protest would include things like spoiled, or lazy, or unappreciative. If that's you, that's basically my starting point as well. And I'd ask you just to stick around for a little bit. I don't necessarily have any relevant qualifications to this subject, and my knowledge is certainly limited. And you might be asking yourself, why should I listen to this guy? What's his motivation? What's his political affiliation? It's not a political issue, it's a human issue. All I have is my story and the things I've learned along the way. I'm doing this as a monologue because I want to try to clearly communicate, and I'm just well aware of the misunderstandings and limitations that come from just text on a screen. My goal here is not to convince you. My goal is to ask you to be open to the possibility that there's other explanations than the ones that you currently have. So where did this all start? I think from a place of cynicism primarily. I wondered why all the fuss? Why do we have all these protests? In some way, I guess I was frustrated because I felt like I thought we solved this already. Why are we still going here? And I probably never said this out loud, but I think my mental proof went something like this. Given slavery is bad, I think we can all agree to that. Slavery ended a long time ago, and when I got personal, it was more like, hey, I didn't take you from your home, and it's not really your home anymore. You wouldn't want to go back. So, therefore, in conclusion, why are we still talking about this? You know, I thought case closed. I'm hoping that you can see the issues with that line of reasoning. If you can't, please stick with me. Maybe my story will help you through your own process. But I realized that I had to repent of that mindset, that process. I had to change direction and not keep thinking about things in that way. I didn't want to do the hard work of trying to experience life through someone else's eyes. It became all about me and what was convenient. And nothing good comes from that. So when did things start to change? Looking back, I think the biggest single event was when I went to a Bridges Out of Poverty workshop. And the whole idea of that workshop was to explore the question, what is it that we can do as individuals, as a community, to help improve the odds that someone who's trying to get out of poverty, that they'll be successful in that. One of the first things we looked at was just, who were the important players in this whole equation. And obviously, the person in poverty themselves is very important. That's the whole personal responsibility thing. We've got the community, the people that come around them. And that could be, church or family or friends or neighbors, all those types of social connections that are important. And then we have the system. And that comes into, government programs and different types of assistance. And when we start looking at this list, what surprised me, the thing that I took away from this the more than anything else, was if one of these three falls through the cracks, the odds of success goes down dramatically. If the community is your problem, if you've got a great desire to be out of poverty, and you've got governmental assistance that you need to get out of poverty, but you don't have those personal relationships to help in the in-between times, it's still also not going to work. It's not the best recipe for success. And finally, if you don't have support from the system, let's say that you've got a great desire to get out of poverty and you've got a lot of support around you, but you don't have that system, that might work for an individual. It might work for two. But the problem is it doesn't scale. What do you get to dozens, hundreds? Can an individual community provide that level of support for someone who's trying to get out of poverty? Odds are it can't. So one of the things that I found fascinating about the Bridges Out of Poverty workshop is this concept of hidden value systems. That's not something I'd ever really thought about before, and I think that's true for a lot of people. By their very nature, they're sort of implicit and under the surface, and we don't talk about them much. One, and hopefully this one's more relatable. There's a bunch of categories. Let's start with this one. It's food. So when you look at food as someone who's in a situation of poverty, what you're looking for is mostly quantity of food. Quantity is the thing you're seeking because if you don't have a lot of food, you want to get food and have some available to you. If you're in the middle class, however, you've got all the food that you want, so it shifts from being about quantity to quality of food. So now all of a sudden I care about, is it good food, not just do I have a bunch of it. And then if you get to the wealthy class, you kind of got the first two, quality, quantity, you got those taken care of, and now it's all about like my presentation. Does the food look good? Different members of our society can value these different things. We're just talking about the social norms, not necessarily an individual could vary on this. And I think if you take a look at restaurants and restaurant preferences, you'll see some of this stuff pop out at you as well. So the one that really, and again, of a dozen categories that exist out there, one that really got my attention was this idea of what is the possession of greatest value to us. And how that shifts across different socioeconomic classes. In the middle class, that often is our things. It could be a car, it could be a tech gadget. It's just like we like our things, we take care of our things. That drives us to a large degree. If we look at wealth, it becomes less about those things because you generally have enough money to get whatever you want. That it now becomes more about like, well, I want to get that unique thing that no one else has, and that's what I'm going to use to impress my other wealthy friends with. If you're a person of poverty, though, what actually drives you, the possession of greatest value, is actually relationships. And let's jump in here and throw out a question. So, what happens if the thing of greatest value to you is taken away? If I'm someone who's in the middle class and my car is stolen, I'm going to call the authorities. I'm going to file a claim of some kind. If I'm somebody who's wealthy and my unique thing is taken away from me, by its very nature, it's probably, it's likely I can't replace it, but I can probably find something else that's unique and just as impressive to my friends. So I'm going to be okay. Got insurance, right? In poverty, if a relationship is taken away from you, like you can't call up the authorities and say like, hey, my friend's not my friend anymore. You can't call your insurance company and tell them that. There's not a great recourse for that, and that's an explanation for some other interesting dynamics that we see. So sometimes your friends and family, the people who are closest to you, aren't going to be supportive of somebody who's trying to get out of poverty, because if you leave, that's one less resource that they have. Now, I don't know that it's necessarily always thought of in that sense. I mean, I don't want to make it sound so transactional. And I think that it's often not done at a conscious level. But you see that pattern play out. And that's one example of something that I kind of took away from this that was fascinating and changed my perception of what it means to be in poverty. Another one is this idea of gaps that exist when you're trying to get off of assistance. The problem is that as you make more and more money, as your income level goes up, your support from the government goes down. And that makes sense. The problem is that it's disproportional. So you might make a modest increase in your income, and that might disqualify you from an even greater amount of support you were getting. So now it's a net loss to you. So it's like really a demotivator in a lot of ways to even try to make it better. And that's an area where like the system could be improved. I also didn't understand the cyclical nature of poverty and what it means to be stuck in poverty. If you don't have a whole lot of money, you probably don't have a great car. If you don't have a great car, that means, and your car's more likely to break down. And if your car breaks down, that means that it's difficult to get to your job. So now I'm either going to be late or I'm going to be absent. And if that happens a couple different times, you're going to lose that job. And if you lose that job, well, now you can't solve the problem with your car because you can't get it fixed or you can't get it replaced. It's also a great place to illustrate where relationships come in. Like if my car breaks down or, I've had my battery die a couple different times and I feel bad asking my neighbor, I'm like, oh man, this is the third time I've had to go like borrow his battery charger. And I feel bad about that, right? Like using the relationships that I have to solve those types of problems is not something that's comfortable for me. That's something that would come more natural to somebody who's in poverty. At this point, you might be asking, hey, why are we talking so much about poverty when we were supposed to be talking about race? And I would say that the answer to that is that black people are disproportionately impacted by poverty. And I can speak to that kind of from my own personal experience as well. When I was a kid, my parents had some apartments in downtown Chambersburg. And to a certain degree, that kind of informed some of my perception of what it meant to be black or to be in poverty. I saw that they had a whole lot of toys that I didn't have, and I'm like, what's going on here? And we would, be there sometimes cleaning stuff out after somebody left or was evicted, and I would look around and go, this place is trashed. Why do these people not take care of their things? If you take care of your things, then you can get more things. We should be good stewards of our things, not realizing how much that's just my own lens I'm looking through, and that their perspective coming out of poverty is very different from mine. And I imagine that what was really happening there was they're looking at it as like, hey, I don't have any place to move these things. I got to go call up my friend and find a place to sleep for the night. So again, it's them valuing that relationship, using that relationship to survive, and going, things are replaceable. We'll solve that problem later. And when you think about racism and prejudice and stereotypes and all this stuff, it comes down to this belief that somehow you're superior to someone else. Maybe I didn't see myself as being superior to them, but I think I certainly thought my value system was superior to theirs. But what I didn't realize is that these different value systems exist for a lot of different reasons, and that trying to actually equate one system's values to another and say, well, this value system is clearly superior to that, trying to label one system as better than the other, it starts to become a challenge. Instead, I propose that we look at that and say, what are things that we can admire in another system? For example, having relationships be at the center of your value system, to me, that's a great thing. I mean, that's better than what we do in the middle class, which is we often love our things and use people. So what about the phrase Black Lives Matter? I think when I first heard that phrase, I was a little bit confused by it. And then I heard the counter phrase, All Lives Matter, and I thought, yeah, that's it. Pick that one because it's more inclusive. What I didn't realize was that it's not trying to take anything away from the rest of us. That's not the intention of the phrase. It's also not meant to be like an equation. And that's sort of how I was thinking about it at first. So if my daughter comes up to me and she says, Daddy, I cut my toe, do I respond to her by saying, well, honey, all toes matter, and you've got other toes and those toes are fine, and your brother's got toes. Why are you being so selfish and only thinking about your toe? Of course we don't do that, right? Like that's crazy because she's hurt. We need to address the issue. And so she wants to hear from me, yes, your toe matters, and your toe matters to me, and now let's go do something about that. Let's go grab a Band-Aid. Like whatever it is that we need to do, let's address it. And what I didn't realize was the depths of pain and hurt and fear that exists today inside of the black community It was completely foreign to me. It's outside of my experience. I can't convince you that this is a real thing. I will say that I think when we realize it's a real thing, we're a lot less likely to make silly arguments about the phrases. I would say if you're someone who finds stats to be a meaningful way that you inform your life, then there's a couple I would suggest that you look at. Specifically, I would look at what's the proportion of death between black and whites at the hands of the police. Take a look at the income and education gaps that exist in a culture today, and specifically take note of what level of education does a black man need to achieve to get to the same level of income that a white man would get with just a high school education. Take a look at incarceration rates. Take a look at specifically the drug conviction rate of African Americans and the drug use rate. Compare that against blacks and whites. There are a lot of really great resources out there that go into this stuff in a lot more detail and a lot better than I ever could. And I also realize that not everyone is on board with stats. Sometimes people try to dismiss them for reasons that aren't entirely legitimate, but I also know some people just aren't wired that way. So if you're not wired that way, I also would recommend a couple different stories. I'm just going to highlight two, and I have more in the description. The first one is Daryl Davis, the Accidental Courtesy. He's the black jazz musician who befriends members of the KKK. And a lot of his story comes out of the fact that when he was 10, he experienced a racist incident, and the question that came out of that was, how can you hate me when you don't even know me? And that's become like his lifelong pursuit. I say that it's inspiring to hear that you can get a black man and a member of the KKK to kind of sit down and have a respectful conversation. They can find enough common ground for that to occur. I feel like that brings hope for the rest of us. Option that I would highly recommend is a Netflix documentary called When They See Us. It's about the Central Park Five. It was in the 90s. There were 5 young black teenagers who were part of a much bigger, there was a whole bunch of other people around at the same time, and these guys just sort of walked into this, and it turned into a situation where essentially the cops framed them for raping and attempting to murder a young white woman who was jogging through the park at the same time. So why is it so important that we address our past wrongs? I think for me, what changed my perception on this the most was when I started to understand the ripple effect that's created by the initial event of slavery. So slavery gives way, we go, that's not cool anymore, and then we go, okay, well, let's just keep blacks and whites separate. And then finally we go, well, that's not acceptable either. And now, instead of being open, now it's kind of under the surface. Now we've got things like mass incarceration. And please go look at the stats on that. There were willful decisions made by the justice system that made the system the way it is today. Another thing that's huge here is the fact that we treat drug abuse as a criminal issue instead of a health issue. A few years ago, my wife and I were able to spend a couple of hours at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. This is another one of those moments that started to really change my perception of what it means to be black versus white in the United States. We were immersed with moments of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and we were inspired by how teenagers were able to make such a radical change to our culture. We were terrified by just how awful our black neighbors were treated during this time frame. The discrimination and greed that led to slavery in the first place hasn't just gone away. It's just taken on new forms. The hatred still exists, and we have to address that. So now what? What are we going to do about it? More importantly, what am I going to do about it? The thing that keeps coming back to me is that it's just so easy to be complacent. We've got so many distractions available, like literally at our fingertips. Even as I was thinking about making this video, I was thinking, hey, there's all these things I'd rather be doing right now. And I was thinking, I don't want to answer the inevitable, but what about questions that come from something like this? I don't want people to see how screwed up I am. And then I realized I'm using the word I a lot, and it's not about me. Justice is important. And as a Christ follower, I know that there is hope. I know that things can change. But I don't know that that's going to happen until we can all acknowledge that there's a real problem here. And for me, I've been convinced that this is real. I hope that you can dig in and see that too. And at the end of the day, what I'm forced to say is that black lives do matter, and that black lives matter to me. And what is it that I can do to make this better? I want to thank you guys for your time. I know this has been a long video. I'm happy to dialogue with anybody who's taken the time to hear me out and who has sincere questions. Certainly wasn't able to say everything I wanted to, but as you can tell, this video is already way too long. And of course, my knowledge is limited, but I'm glad to share anything that I've learned. I hope this helps someone out there. God bless. Have a good day.